Turkey is building its first fully fledged aircraft carrier, a vessel more than 300 meters long. Once completed, it will be shorter only than American and Chinese supercarriers. This powerful Mugem-class ship, whose construction began in 2025, stands as a symbol of the path Turkey has taken under Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. The new Sultan of the Bosphorus has ruled the country for more than 2 decades. During that time, Turkey has undergone the most profound transformation since the era of the republic's founder, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. Erdogan has fundamentally redefined Turkey's international position. After decades spent on the margins of the geopolitical chessboard, the country has emerged as a textbook example of an assertive regional power, one determined to leverage its full potential and play for the highest stakes. Today, much like in the days of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey once again projects power far beyond the Anatolian heartland. Turkish influence now stretches from Syria and Libya, through the Caucasus, all the way to the Horn of Africa. But every empire exacts a price. Turkey is no exception. The foundations of the power structure built by Erdogan are showing increasing signs of erosion. A deep economic crisis, the concentration of authority in the president's hands, and routine crackdowns of political opposition have become the defining features of Erdogan's third decade in power. Together, these trends have driven down support for both the president and his Justice and Development Party, AKP, making it progressively harder for them to retain control. Under constitutional changes introduced by Erdogan several years ago, 2028 should mark the end of his presidency. Although the president has publicly declared that he does not intend to seek another term, the ruling camp is simultaneously pushing for a new constitutional overhaul, one that could either clear the way for Erdogan to remain in office, or, at the very least, secure his influence for years to come. These suspicions are not unfounded. As work on new constitution proceeds, potential rivals are being systematically neutralized. The most striking example has been the arrest of Ekrem İmamoğlu, who in some polls was projected to defeat Erdogan in a future presidential election. It remains unclear whether we are witnessing the final chapter of Erdogan's rule, but the current geopolitical moment offers a timely opportunity to examine the mechanisms that have allowed him to stay in power for more than 20 years. How did Erdogan do it? And is his era finally coming to an end? Political decisions increasingly shape not just international relations, but currencies, inflation and investor confidence as well. Turkey under Recep Tayyip Erdogan is a clear example of how tightly politics and financial markets are connected. In a world like this, understanding global events from a financial perspective becomes increasingly important. That is why I use XTB, an investment platform that helps me analyze global trends and respond to market changes based on data rather than emotions. With XTB, you get access to over 8,400 stocks and ETFs from markets around the world, with zero commission up to 100,000 euros in monthly turnover. Above that, a standard 0.2% fee applies, with a minimum of 10 euros. In addition, XTB has prepared a free report for 2026, showing how geopolitics may affect the markets. Download it via the link in the description and see which forecasts could translate into real investment decisions. As always, remember that investing involves risk. To understand Erdogan's story, we need to examine it across 3 main dimensions: the economy, domestic politics, and grand geopolitics. We begin inevitably with the economy. Without grasping the mechanics of the so-called Turkish economic miracle of the AKP's first decade in power, it is impossible to understand today's Turkey. When the newly formed Justice and Development Party, AKP, took power in November 2002, Turkey's economy was in ruins. Throughout the 1990s, average annual inflation hovered around 75%, while the state treasury was drowning in debt. The crisis reached its climax in 2001, when a sudden withdrawal of foreign investors triggered a collapse of the Turkish lira and caused GDP to shrink by roughly 6%. It was precisely at this moment that Erdogan entered the stage, as his party won the parliamentary elections in 2002. He inherited not only a country in deep economic distress, but also a ready-made stabilization program prepared by the economist Kemal Dervish in cooperation with experts from the International Monetary Fund. The plan envisioned far-reaching market liberalization. Erdogan not only implemented the IMF recovery program with iron discipline, at times bordering on neoliberal orthodoxy, but also launched formal accession negotiations with the European Union. This in turn led to a sharp surge in foreign direct investment. As a result, Erdogan moved quickly to pull Turkey out of economic collapse. The scale of this success is best illustrated by macroeconomic data. Between 2002 and 2012, average GDP growth stood at 5.2%, while in peak years such as 2004 and 2011, the economy expanded by an impressive 9.9% and 11% respectively. Erdogan also managed to bring inflation under control. By 2004, it had fallen below 10%, paving the way for the redenomination of the Turkish lira the following year. Erdogan's success, however, was not limited to macroeconomic indicators. It was also, and perhaps above all, a sociological and class-based transformation. His policies led to an unprecedented economic emancipation of the conservative population living in Turkey's Anatolian heartland. Cities such as Kayseri, Konya, Gaziantep, and Denizli, proudly dubbed the Anatolian Tigers, emerged as hubs of new dynamic middle class. For Erdogan, this new Anatolian middle class became the bedrock of his political power. Millions of people who had long felt marginalized by the old Kemalist elites suddenly gained not only political agency, but also tangible upward mobility. Between 2002 and 2012, per capita income measured in purchasing power parity rose from roughly $9,000 to more than $18,000, while poverty rates fell sharply. It was these voters, grateful for their social ascent, who formed Erdogan's ironclad base. A constituency willing to forgive the leader almost any political misstep or breach of democratic norms. After all, in their eyes, it was the leader who had lifted them out of poverty. Erdogan's economic success, however, proved to be remarkably fragile. The first cracks in the armor began to appear around 2013, as global financial conditions shifted and the prospect of EU membership started to fade. It was then that Erdogan fundamentally changed Turkey's economic model. Balanced growth based on exports, productivity, and integration with the West was replaced by a steroid-fueled model driven by domestic consumption, cheap credit, and above all, construction. This was the birth of what came to be known as the economy of concrete. Human and financial capital, instead of flowing into innovative and high-value sectors, was massively redirected into unproductive assets, shopping malls, luxury housing projects, and large-scale infrastructure. Construction's share of GDP increased, but at the expense of industrial competitiveness. Worse still, the construction sector became a vehicle for corruption and clientelism. Major public contracts were funneled to a narrow circle of conglomerates, the so-called Gang of Five, which in turn helped finance the AKP's political machine. When economic growth eventually slowed, the consequences were severe. In 2021, the Turkish lira collapsed, losing 44% of its value, followed by another 30% in 2022. Official inflation soared, peaking at 86% in October 2022. Independent estimates by the INAC research group suggested that real inflation exceeded 100%. The crisis was exacerbated by Erdogan himself. Determined to preserve cheap credit for the construction sector, he, against basic economic logic, blocked interest rate hikes. Only in late 2023 did the president allow a departure from his controversial Erdoğanomics, approving an austerity program and raising interest rates to 50%. But the move came far too late, by at least 2 years. As a result, inflation today still hovers around 30%, and the lira continues to lose value. Assessing Erdogan's economic legacy is therefore deeply complex. On the one hand, the AKP's first decade in power brought rapid growth and a genuine social mobility for millions in Turkey's Anatolian heartland. On the other hand, the opportunities created during that period were never fully exploited. Erdogan's stubborn adherence to Erdoğanomics ultimately plunged the country into a deep economic crisis, one Turkey remains trapped in today. Yet one thing must be acknowledged. Erdogan managed to create economic conditions stable enough that the gradual dismantling of the old system did not trigger large-scale social unrest. Erdogan's political journey has been long, dramatic and deeply turbulent. In 1999, he was sent to prison for reciting a poem, an episode widely seen at the time as the end of his political career. And yet by 2014, he had become the first president in Turkish history elected by popular vote. 2 years later, he survived a military coup attempt. Today he wields power that is in practice autocratic. How did this happen? How did Erdogan manage to dismantle the Kemalist system, deliberately designed by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk to protect the Turkish Republic from precisely the kind of political figure Erdogan represents? To understand this, we must return to the early years of AKP rule. Although Erdogan's party was winning elections, its real position within the state apparatus was remarkably weak. The quote, old Turkey, dominated by secular Kemalist elites, still controlled the military, the bureaucracy, and the judiciary. For these circles, Erdogan's Islamist roots represented an existential threat. Erdogan had the votes, but he lacked loyal cadres within the state. Without them, he was little more than a temporary tenant, fully exposed to the will of the military, which since the founding of the republic in 1923 had cast itself as the self-appointed guardian of the constitution, toppling governments in 1960, 1971, 1980 and 1997. To survive, Erdogan entered into a tactical alliance with the movement led by Fethullah Gülen, the Gülenists who had spent years cultivating a cadre of loyalists educated in their own schools, and who possessed extensive influence within the police, prosecution service, and judiciary, became Erdogan's key allies in his struggle against the Kemalist establishment. The high point of this cooperation came with the infamous Ergenekon and Balyoz trials, which unfolded between 2008 and 2013. Under the banner of fighting the so-called deep state and alleged clandestine networks plotting coups, hundreds of high-ranking military officers, including generals and admirals, were arrested, alongside journalists and intellectuals critical of the AKP. These trials marked a decisive moment, the breaking of the military's political power and the systemic dismantling of the old Kemalist order. Once the common enemy had been eliminated, the alliance between the AKP and the Gülenists began to fracture under the weight of an internal struggle over spoils and influence. The climax of this rivalry came on the night of July 15th to 16th, 2016, when mutinous military units took to the streets of Ankara and Istanbul. Erdogan accused Fethullah Gülen of orchestrating a failed coup and used the attempt as a pretext to crush not only the Gülenist movement, but also a much broader spectrum of political opponents. The state of emergency imposed after the coup lasted 2 years. During that period, more than 100,000 people were arrested, and over 150,000 employees of the state apparatus were dismissed from their jobs. The most sweeping purges took place within the military and the judiciary, where roughly 1/3 of all judges and prosecutors were removed. The final act in dismantling the old system came with the 2017 constitutional referendum, which approved Turkey's transition from a parliamentary system to a presidential one. With this move, Erdogan eliminated the last remaining checks and balances of the old order and consolidated full power in his own hands. The center of decision-making shifted from the parliament building to the vast presidential palace complex in Beştepe. Ministries were reduced to the role of technical executive secretariats, while parliament lost its real legislative and oversight functions. Erdoganism as a system of governance came to rest on presidential decrees and pervasive micromanagement. And so today we are witnessing the final, mature form of this transformation. With both the Kemalists and the Gulenists sidelined, the state apparatus no longer poses any threat to Erdogan. Instead, he is now free to instrumentalize the law and the justice system to systematically eliminate his political rivals. The clearest example is the case of Ekrem İmamoğlu. When he won the mayoral election in Istanbul in 2019, the AKP challenged the result and forced a repeat vote, which İmamoğlu won again, this time by an even larger margin. The AKP machine, however, did not relent, especially as İmamoğlu began to be seen as a politician capable of defeating Erdogan in a presidential race. In 2022, İmamoğlu was sentenced to 2 years in prison for referring to members of the election commission as, quote, fools. Then in March 2025, just as the opposition Republican People's Party was preparing to nominate him as its candidate in the next presidential election, he was arrested on corruption charges and stripped of his university degree, a move that effectively barred him from registering his candidacy. The story of Erdogan and İmamoğlu carries an unmistakable echo of a well-known pop cultural maxim: you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a villain. Erdogan has become the mirror image of the system he once fought against. The man who went to prison in 1999 for reciting a poem, once a symbol of the struggle for freedom of speech, now uses the power of the state to silence the opposition. This observation completes a bleak picture of Turkey's internal transformation. But to fully understand the revolution Erdogan has brought to Turkish politics, we must now turn to the third arena of his activity, the realm of grand geopolitics. Erdogan has definitively broken with the Kemalist doctrine of restraint and isolationism, encapsulated in the famous slogan, "Peace at home, peace in the world." In its place, he has pursued an assertive and often aggressive foreign policy, symbolized by military interventions in Syria and Libya, support for Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, and the establishment of military bases in Somalia. The key strategic concept driving Turkey's expansion in the Mediterranean basin is the doctrine of the so-called Blue Homeland, Mavi Vatan. This doctrine significantly expands Turkey's maritime claims in the eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean Sea, and the Black Sea. Its most tangible expression was Turkey's intervention in Libya's civil war in 2020. Turkish support saved the Tripoli-based government from collapse, and in return, Ankara secured a maritime boundary agreement that effectively legitimized its claims in the Mediterranean. A similar pattern emerged in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Turkish drones, military advisors, and intelligence support tipped the balance decisively in Azerbaijan's favor. This not only cemented Ankara's position as a key power broker in South Caucasus, but ultimately forced Armenia to open the so-called Zangezur corridor. This corridor is of critical importance not only for Turkish-Azerbaijani relations, but also for Ankara's broader ambitions in Central Asia. A direct land connection between Ankara and Baku on the Caspian Sea strengthens Erdogan's pan-Turkic project, pursued under the banner of the so-called Organization of Turkic States, and reinforces Turkey's role as a transport and energy hub linking Europe and Asia. The most visible symbol of this new, assertive Turkish foreign policy has been drones. Above all, the Bayraktar TB2. They allow Turkey to project power at relatively low cost, and with minimal risk of its own casualties. The geographical reach of this influence is striking, from Syria and Libya, through Ukraine, all the way to the Horn of Africa. In 2024, Turkey signed a historic defense pact with Somalia, under which Ankara effectively assumed responsibility for protecting Somali territorial waters for a decade, in exchange for a share in future oil and gas revenues and the right to expand its military base and port infrastructure. This has given Turkey a strong military foothold at the very entrance to the Red Sea. Yet Erdogan's record is not one of unbroken success. His attempt to balance between Russia and the United States, most notably through the purchase of the Russian S-400 air defense system, proved to be a strategic miscalculation. The price was Turkey's expulsion from the F-35 fighter jet program. As a result, Turkey's first quasi-aircraft carrier, the TCG Anadolu, originally designed to operate these aircraft, had to be reconfigured to carry domestically produced drones instead. Turkey's foreign policy has also been deeply shaped by the ongoing economic crisis. In search of petrodollars, currency swap lines, and export markets, Erdogan has been forced into a series of pragmatic diplomatic compromises, most notably with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. This is also a good moment to pause and examine Turkey's policy towards Syria, the most visible testing ground for Turkish neo-Ottomanism. While the fall of Bashar al-Assad is often portrayed as a triumph for Ankara, the real balance sheet of this intervention remains ambiguous. Ahmed al-Shara, the new ruler in Damascus, with whom Turkey now maintains pragmatic relations, was never Erdogan's preferred partner. For years, Ankara invested enormous resources in other rebel factions, which ultimately lost the race for power. Although Turkey is now the principal sponsor and guarantor of the new Syrian government, it is simultaneously a hostage to that government's fragile stability. The collapse of Assad's rule did not end the civil war, nor did it put an end to the chaos gripping the country. American forces remain stationed in northern Syria, while local Kurdish formations refused to submit to Damascus. Moreover, an increasingly sharp conflict between Turkey and Israel is emerging on the horizon, with Syria once again at its center. Despite mediation efforts by Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu has shown no willingness to compromise with al-Shara and is effectively pursuing the creation of an Israeli protectorate in southern Syria. In doing so, Israel has placed itself on a direct collision course with Ankara's interests, as Turkey backs al-Shara. This confrontation not only complicates Turkey's ambitions in the Mediterranean basin, but also puts further strain on its already tense relationship with Washington. The balance sheet of more than 2 decades of Erdogan's rule is thus bittersweet and full of paradoxes. Turkey enters 2026 as a regional power, with influence stretching from the Libyan desert to the shores of the Caspian Sea, yet also as a state weakened by deep internal dysfunction. It would be false to claim that all of the economic gains from Erdogan's first decade in power have been squandered, but there is little doubt that in recent years, Erdogan has sacrificed the prosperity and financial stability of ordinary citizens in favor of building state power. While the government boasts of modern air forces, drones, massive airports, and nominal GDP growth, the collapse of the lira and persistently high inflation have made the average Turk materially poorer, turning society into little more than fuel for the leader's great power narrative. Worse still, in the name of his vision of a new Turkey, Erdogan has completely dismantled the old system and replaced it with an autocratic power structure centered on a single individual, himself. Under the current constitution, Erdogan's presidential term, which ends in 2028, should be his last. But the very nature of the authoritarian system he has built makes voluntary retirement from politics the least likely scenario. Erdoganism does not provide for retirement, because the system lacks safeguards that would guarantee personal immunity after relinquishing power. This logic explains the push for a new civilian constitution to replace the current 1982 charter, a legacy of the military coup. Although the official narrative speaks of democratizing the republic, and Erdogan himself suggests that he has no intention of seeking re-election, His critics harbor no illusions about his true objectives. The overriding goal of the new constitution is either to reset the presidential term counter or to create a legal mechanism enabling lifelong rule. In May 2025, Erdogan appointed a special legal commission to work on the draft, but parliamentary arithmetic remains unforgiving. The ruling coalition, the AKP and the nationalist MHP, holds 324 seats. Submitting constitutional amendments to a referendum requires 360 votes, while passing them directly through parliament requires 400 votes. Erdogan does not command such power, forcing him into further tactical pivots. In this context, renewed peace talks with the Kurds and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, can be understood as a part of a broader strategy. Any agreement would likely require constitutional changes to once again regulate the Kurdish issue, creating an opportunity for Erdogan to introduce, alongside them, revisions affecting the presidency itself. If Erdogan ultimately fails to amend the constitution, he will be forced to leave the presidential palace in 2028. Who could succeed him? That question is far from straightforward. Erdoganism, as a highly personalized system, has failed to develop a clear, institutionalized mechanism for the transfer of power. As a result, speculation has centered on several key figures representing different factions within the ruling camp. Polls conducted in late 2025 offered revealing insight into the preferences of the AKP's voter base. The strongest support goes to figures from the state apparatus, such as Hakan Fidan, longtime head of the MIT intelligence service and now foreign minister, with 33% support, and Süleyman Soylu, the former powerful interior minister, with 32% support. Members of the president's family, despite their media prominence, command far less trust. Erdogan's son, Bilal, polls at 14%, while his son-in-law, Selçuk Bayraktar, whose father founded Baykar, the company behind Turkey's famous drones, stands at 13%. This suggests that even Erdogan's core electorate prefers institutional continuity over dynastic succession. Erdogan, however, continues to delay naming a successor, fully aware that in an authoritarian system, the emergence of an official heir marks the political death of the incumbent ruler, as elite loyalties immediately begin to shift toward the rising sun. Today, Turkey stands at a historic crossroads. Although Erdogan still controls the state apparatus, his popularity has suffered irreversible erosion. The absence of a clear successor and uncertainty over whether the constitution can be changed raise a fundamental question. Can a political system tailored to the quote Sultan survive without its creator?